We're going to go to Exodus chapter 3 this morning and continue our journey through Exodus. When I was a kid in elementary school, each I don't know, is fifth, sixth grade, something like that, we had to do the sixth grade science project. How many remember that? You had to do like the science project, yeah. So it was my year to do the science project, okay? All right, and so what this included was an actual experiment, like science experiment that you had to do, and then a paper, documenting that experiment, and you know the drill, right? Those of you that were either parents that had to help a kid do this, or you actually had to do it yourself. I'm really distracted right now, so I'm. Ruth, if you could just take the water off the walls, that would help me out a lot. Otherwise, I'm gonna get seasick up here. And if you need some help doing that, a cross is good. Cross is good. We'll go with that. Our Jonah series is over, so we're out of the water. That's not Ruth's fault. That's a training. Ruth is brand new on the iMag, and so I did not train her on how to get rid of the water. So that is my fault. Back to my science project. So I had a science project to do. And so what happened is, so in elementary school, just so that you know a little bit about me, when it came to elementary school, I was not particularly into science or math or history or English. Didn't care so much for any of that aspect of school. And so another thing about me is if I could procrastinate, I would. So I figured the day before the science project was due would be a good time to start, right? How many of you that makes perfect sense? Yes, absolutely. So I go to my dad, like, Dad, science project. Now, what you have to know about my dad is that super smart, really smart guy. My dad, before he became a pastor, actually worked as a chemist, so science was his thing. I did not get those genes. They did not pass down to me. And so it's like, Dad, science project. And after he kind of got through his frustration, as frustrated as he was with me, this is what my dad did. He stayed up, and I remember it to this day, he stayed up with me pretty much all night. I mean, it was till like 4 or 5 in the morning, putting together what actually was at the time a pretty elaborate. So you can't be a former scientist and then your kids show up with like mold, like, hey, I grew mold. How many of you did the mold experiment? Like that's the, hey, go find some bread and there should be mold on it and write about it. Okay, my dad couldn't do the moldy bread experiment. He had to do something like legit. Okay. And so we are building this thing, and I don't even know what it was. I don't know. It had a nail on it, and it had a magnet, and it had Freon gas, and it had all these things. I don't know what it was. But my dad did, and it looked awesome. And so he stayed up with me all night, putting together. And can we all just be honest for a minute, okay? Those of you the science projects are never done by the kids. They're always the parents' projects. Right? Can we just be honest that they're always the parents' projects and the kids just watch? Unless you do the moldy bread one, anyone can do that. But if my kid comes to me, I'm like, hey, go find some mold, bro, because that's all I got. So my dad stays with me all night. And I complete this project, and then I remember it, okay? I'm sitting down with a paper and a pen, and my dad is saying, write this. So I wrote it. My dad, it was through inspiration from my father. Plenary, verbal inspiration straight from my father's mouth. I wrote the paper. And so I bring it in like a boss the next day with this awesome, I'm walking into school like a boss with this awesome science project and this well-written, articulated paper. And, it was awesome. Got a good grade, and all the kids were like, oh, what's that? That's like a nail. Yeah, and it's a magnet. And what's that gas you turn on? I'm like, I don't know, but it's awesome. And I got to thinking as I was preparing for this message, isn't that the way it is with God sometimes? Or like all the time? Like Like God comes to his people, and God doesn't need us, does he? It's not like God got a good deal when he got you, like when you got saved. Okay, it's not like the NBA draft. It's like, yes, I got him on my team. Okay, we bring to the table a lot of brokenness and a lot of weakness, don't we? Like when we came to Christ, we brought all of our baggage, right? And so God has all of these like inadequate, weak, struggling sons and daughters that are a part of his family. He calls us children, adopted sons and daughters. We talked about that from the book of Romans in our Set Free series back in May. And yet, God in his mercy and his grace, he calls us to serve him. He calls us to certain tasks. Like God could accomplish whatever he wants in his own power, couldn't he? But God does something interesting. God takes those whom he calls to be his sons and daughters, and then he sends them out to accomplish significant things in this world. So God takes weak and broken men and women, and he uses them to do spectacular things. Not because he needs us. It's not like I really need you to do this, because without you, I don't know what. No, because he wants to display something through us. And so I was thinking about my dad and turning in that project. It was really my dad's wisdom, right? My dad's direction, my father's ideas. And I helped him put it together, and I came in with this awesome science project. And in life, what happens is God calls us to certain tasks. They're his tasks with his vision, his goals, and his purposes. And you know what he does? He says, come along. I want you to be a part of this. And it's going to be awesome. But along the way, I want you to realize that these tasks are not going to be easy all the time. That what I'm going to call you to sometimes is going to be really difficult. And it's going to stretch you. It's going to push you. It's going to pull you out of that comfort zone that you're in. See, we all like our comfort zones, don't we? We all like to be comfortable. And God says, no, I've got more for you, and I've got bigger plans for you than you just existing in this little comfort zone. I've got bigger dreams for you than that. And so last week, we traced the covenantal promise made to Abraham of land, offspring, and blessing. So keep those three things in mind as we continue to unpack the book of Exodus. That everything that's really happening in Exodus is a result of God's promise to Abraham, where he says, Abraham, I promise you these three things: a land, a place of restored fellowship with God, an offspring, a people enjoying a restored fellowship with God, and a blessing, an actual opportunity to have a restored fellowship with God, fellowship that was once broken, now restored. I promise these things to you, Abraham. And so after 400 years of slavery in Egypt, we saw last week how God what? God heard the cry of the Israelites. In verse 24 of chapter 2, God heard their groaning, and God what? God remembered his covenant with Abraham. God had not forgotten. Just because the Israelites were in a situation where they were under oppression and bondage, it does not mean that God had forgotten them, and it does not mean that God had forgotten his promise, and that God had neglected them. So we learned last week that even when it seems like God is silent, it does not mean that he is absent. He's actually at work. And so God heard them, and God remembered. So God hears us, and God remembers his promises to us. And the promise that he made to Abraham with Isaac and with Jacob, verse 25 of chapter 2, God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. And so where do we go from here? Because as we noticed last week that Israel was still in bondage, Moses, who grew up in Pharaoh's own palace because his mom had hid him in the Nile, Pharaoh's daughter had found him. He was brought to the palace, and as an Israelite, he was raised in the palace of Pharaoh. We saw how Moses, looking at the oppression of his people, the Israelites, got really angry when he saw an Egyptian harming an Israelite, and so what does he do? Well, he does what any of us would do. He kills him, right? I mean, he just straight up, bare hands, goes after the dude and just kills him. Well, this proposes a problem for Moses because the next day it's discovered that someone saw and that word was getting around that Moses had killed an Egyptian. Word gets back to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh's really upset, and Pharaoh says, I'm going to kill Moses. So Moses has to do what? He has to run. He has to flee. He has to get out. So he heads to the desert. And there in the desert, Moses finds Jethro, who has some daughters, and Moses marries the daughter of Jethro, the priest there in the desert, who had sheep. And Moses is tending his father-in-law's sheep, living in the backside of the desert, never intending to head back to Egypt. So Moses, he's good. He's got a family. He's putting down roots. He's in the desert watching sheep, and apparently he's cool with that. Like sometimes just going to the desert and watching sheep sounds like a good idea. Like, you know what? If all I had to worry about was just a couple sheep running off, man, hey, that would be cool. But I think that's where Moses was. He's just like, hey, this is my life now, and I'm good with that. But God had a promise to keep. God had a commitment to fulfill to his people, to his children. So we begin in chapter 3, verse 1. It says, Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Verse 2, pay close attention. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. Now let me stop right here and explain what's happening. Anytime you see the title Angel of the Lord in the Old Testament, okay, this is an appearance of Jesus to his people. This is not an angel, like an angelic being. This is the Son of God himself, angel of Yahweh. Most theologians agree that this is what we call a pre-incarnate or a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus to his people. So as Jesus himself is a part of the rescue plan to rescue people, yes, from the bondage of Egypt, ultimately from the bondage of sin, he comes to Moses, the angel of Yahweh, Christ himself, not in the form of a man. He would come in the fashion of a man later, but in what? In a flame? In a bush? And he looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. So weird, right? So that catches Moses. Like a burning bush that was burning, okay, maybe not such a big deal, but the bush was burning, yet nothing was being consumed. So Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. And when the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. Okay, put yourself in the situation. The fire in the bush is not consumed, and he hears his name. I don't know how this sounded. I don't know if it was, the loud, the booming, Moses, Moses. I don't think it was like that. I think Moses. Moses. And Moses said, here I am. Then he said, do not come near. See, there's something about the presence of God that is holy. There's something about the presence of God that is not for common sinful men. He says, take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. Why? Because the presence of God was there. And so then God introduces himself. He says, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. You see, Moses had heard of Abraham. Moses knew of Isaac and Moses knew of Jacob. He knew his heritage and he knew the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were the Israelites. Moses knew all of that. Moses knew the promise that God had made to Abraham of offspring, of land, of blessing. Moses knew of all of that. And so when God appears to Moses and says, Moses, I am God, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. There was a reverence, there was a fear, and there was a respect. There was not like, what's up? Hey! No. There was, as he was in the presence of God, there was an actual fear. Why? Because he, as a sinful man, found himself in the presence of glory. And he hid his face. And the Lord said, and I love the way God talks. He says, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings. And I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. He says, I remember the land I promised, a place of restored fellowship. And now behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. So here we have in this text, and we're going to study this for the next 2 weeks, this week and next, is God's call on Moses. And when God calls his people to do his work, it's not because he needs them, but because he wants to display his glory through them. And what we have to understand is that the greatest tasks are not accomplished by the ones called, but accomplished by the one who calls them. So the greatest tasks that God calls his people to are not accomplished by you or me, but accomplished by him who calls us. It's not up to us to accomplish things for God. It's up to us to allow God to accomplish his stuff through us. And so what we're going to find is that God comes to Moses and he calls them. But what we have to realize, first of all, is that when God calls someone, that his call is always rooted in his grace. So when God takes men and women that are his children and he says, I want you to do something, at the core and the center of the tasks that he's called us to do is something called grace. He wants to do something in this world through you and me where grace is shown to people who don't deserve it, but people to whom God wants to give it. So what is the source, or what is at the center of Moses' call? Why does God call Moses? Well, God says, he says, first of all, Moses, I have seen their affliction. I've seen it, Moses. And because I've seen their affliction, I have also heard their cry. Does God hear the cry of his people? Yes or no? It doesn't seem like it sometimes, does it? But God hears our cry. And his call upon us is rooted in the fact that he sees the affliction. Do you think that God sees what sin does to people? Do you think that God sees how much sin has wrecked people's lives? Do you think that does something to the heart of God? The fact that God would say, hey, I've seen the affliction of sin upon people's lives, and I'm calling people from Faith at Sellersville to a task to deliver them from that sin. See, God's call is rooted in his grace. What God's asking us to do is rooted in the fact that he's a gracious God that wants to do something miraculous. He saw their affliction, he heard their cry, and he knew their suffering. So when God calls a people to a mission, as he was calling Moses, It is because God sees the affliction, he hears the crying, he knows the sufferings of the people that he's going after. And guess what? He calls us to take the message of hope and deliverance and rescue to those who are afflicted, to those who are crying, and to those who are suffering because of sin. So our mission to reach people far from Christ and teach them to follow him is rooted in the grace that God wants to show hundreds and hundreds of people in our community. So if God is a God of grace, and God calls his people to participate in his work of grace in people's lives, what does that mean? That means that the same grace that God wants to show a lost, hurting, broken world is the same grace that we need to have and we need to show to a lost, broken, hurting world. Do you think Moses cared about his Israelite family? Do you think he did? I believe he did. I believe he did. And God did too. And out of that grace, he wanted to show the Israelites. God comes to Moses and he says, Moses, here's what I want you to do. Go to Pharaoh. Okay, now, this is the interesting thing because, when are God's missions and God's tasks for his people ever easy? Does God ever call us to do something that is easy? Moses, go back to Pharaoh. Excuse me, God. The reason I'm in the desert is because Pharaoh wanted to kill me. God knew that, right? No, go to Pharaoh and bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. I mean, it's funny. It's just this is what I'm going to have you do, Moses. This isn't like some small. There were hundreds. There was as many as maybe 400,000, maybe even more than that, maybe even double of that. You hear anywhere from 500,000 to 1 million Israelites that were living in Egypt. It's not like you just walk into Pharaoh and say, "Hey, Pharaoh, hey, remember me, Moses? Yeah, hey, all of the Israelites all your slave labor, I'm going to need them to come with me. Is that cool?" From a human perspective, this task not only sounds ridiculous, it sounds impossible, doesn't it? What in the world? You want me to go? Okay, so Moses, understandably, has some questions for God, right? And that's okay. You ever had some questions for God? God, it seems like you're leading down this road, but I don't know if you were aware of this, this, and this. That's us. And fortunately, God has the patience to handle our questions. And verse 11, but Moses said to God, first of all, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? Great plan, God. Love it. Love the plan. Wrong guy. Wrong guy. Certainly there's someone more qualified than me. Maybe someone that Pharaoh doesn't want to kill. I've blown it, God. I murdered an Egyptian and I ran. I've got a past and a history there some baggage that, great plan, wrong guy. Let someone else do it. You ever had that conversation with God? Let someone else do it. Because I am inadequate. And can I tell you something as a loving pastor? Of course you are. Of course you're inadequate. Of course you're weak. Of course you are. If you were adequate, if you were strong enough, if you were wise enough, and you accomplished whatever it is that God was having you do, what would be the result of that? How awesome is God, or how awesome am I? You see, God is about his glory. Make no mistake of that, church. God is passionate for his glory, displaying his power, his mercy, his grace through you and through me. So Moses says, who am I? And I love what God says. He says, but I will be with you. I'll be with you. And so when God calls out of his grace, he guarantees his presence. He guarantees his presence. He says, I'll be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. So God promises, Moses, I'm going to be with you. So that when God calls his people to accomplish whatever works of grace he is interested in accomplishing in people's lives, in our communities, in our culture, he guarantees, listen, church, he guarantees that he'll be with you. God doesn't send his people out and then leave them hanging, leave them hung out to dry. God doesn't operate that way. When God sends and when God calls, it is because God will be with them every step of the way. Science project, I got to do it every step of the way. Okay, Doug, do this. Put this screw in here. Mount that there. Write these words. Do this. God says, I'm going to be with you, Moses. Of course you've got baggage, Moses. Of course you're a failure. I knew that. I knew all of that. Like God knew Moses. God knew who he was. God knew his past. God knew his baggage. And yet in this moment, God says, Moses, I want to use you for this. Nobody else, Moses, you. And if I'm calling you, I'm going to be with you every step of the way. And so God chooses the weak and insignificant to display his power. God promises his presence to those he calls. So here's the conclusion of that. And I've said this before, and I'm going to say it again because I believe it with all my heart. If you knew, like Moses knew, that God was with you. See, that's the key, isn't it? If God's not with me, then I got all kinds of fears. I got all kinds of reasons why we shouldn't do this and why we shouldn't move on this and we shouldn't. If God's not with me, it's up to me. But if God's with you and if you really believe that, see, I think a lot of times we in our minds, yeah, God's with us. But I don't know that we really believe that. See, what great faith in a big God to accomplish great things produces is men and women who are willing to step out in faith and say, yes, I will do this. We will go. We as a church will move on this. We will press forward. Why? Because we actually believe that God is with us, and we actually believe that he's big enough to accomplish what he's calling us to do. Do you actually believe that? And if you actually believed it, if you really understood that God was with you as he promised to Moses, what would you do? What would you do? What's he calling you to do? What's he calling you to be a part of? What's he asking you to give up? Find out what that is. What is it that God's pressing in your heart? It may be a small thing. It may be a major thing. I don't know, but what is it? As a church, we have to ask this same question. As a corporate body, we as a church, what is it that God's asking us to do day by day, year by year? What is it? What does God want us to do? And some of those things will be small. Some of those things may be really, really big. But if we believe that God is with us, and if we believe that God is moving in a direction, we must go forward because God has promised to be with us. He's promised to be with us. And so then once you're called, and you know God is with you, and you want to answer the call, and you want to move forward, what will always happen? Listen, what will always happen is Satan will use either other individuals or Satan will use your own fears to make you question whether or not this can really be done. There will always be obstacles in your way. Listen, you want to serve God? You want to live a life that counts? You want to live a life that matters? Guess what? Guess what you're going to face? Obstacles. It will happen. There will be things that will stand in your way. There will be excuses that you'll want to make. There will always be obstacles as to why this shouldn't be done. And when you hit an obstacle, or when you come up against an excuse as to why we can't do this and why this shouldn't be done and why this is too big, there's two things that you need to be brought back to. And these are two things, as a pastor trying to help lead a church, that when we face obstacles, and as Moses was being called to lead the people out of Egypt, when he was thinking about obstacles and why he shouldn't go, there were two things that God presented to Moses. After God promises his presence, okay, fine, God, you'll be with me. Then Moses in verse 13 said to God, excuse number one, fear number one, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? So Moses is playing it out. Moses has come back to Egypt and say, hey, everybody, God sent me. Come, let's go. I mean, Moses is like, I just don't see that going well. So they're going to be like, okay, Moses, what's his name? Who is this God even? God of our fathers? You mean the one that's forsaken us in Egypt for 400 years? That God? What do I say to him, God? And in verse 14, God said to Moses, I am who I am. Now, in the Hebrew, Moses understood exactly what God was saying. God was saying, I am the God who calls you, so focus first of all on who I am. And when he says I am, he's saying I am the God who calls, I am eternal, I'm self-existent, I'm all-powerful, and I am in need of no one. So when Moses says, who are you? What is your name? What do I tell them? He says, tell them, I am who I am. In verse 14, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say this to the people of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is his name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. So the first thing that God calls Moses to focus upon is not the task. See, Moses was focusing on, okay, what are they going to say? I'm not the right guy, everything. God says, Moses, don't focus on the task. Focus on who I am. I am the great I am. So when in the Hebrew he says I am, he's saying all of those things. I am eternal. I am self-existent. I am all-powerful. I am in need of nobody. There is none beside me. I am the one, the true, the only God of heaven. All of the idols, all of the gods of the Egyptians, there are none other but me. I am him and him alone. And I call and I give the power to accomplish the task to the ones I call. This is what God is saying when he says, I am, has sent me to you. There are no other gods but me. I am he. And so when we set out to accomplish the calling of God upon our lives, when opposition faces us, when excuses and fear cloud the vision, a lot of times, listen, ministry is tough. Serving God can be really hard. It can be difficult. And if we focus on the task, and if we focus on the issues, and we focus on the problems, and we focus on our own inadequacies, guess what happens? We fail. We give up. We get burned out. We bail. Some of you have been there. Some of you are maybe right there right now. This can't be done. Why am I doing this? Maybe I should give up. And what God calls you to focus on is first of all what he called Moses to focus on, and that was him and his character. That God's call necessitates that you know and recall and remember and be focused on who he is. not the size of the task or the opposition against you. So when we as a body are faced with opposition or mountains that stand in our way or whatever, focus on who God is. Focus on the fact that we serve the great I am. That we must believe that he is who he said he is, and that he is powerful enough to accomplish whatever it is he's called us to do. Second thing he focuses Moses' attention on is what? Then the task. He says, I am has sent me to you. This is my name forever. And then verse 16, he refocuses him on the task. Go and gather the elders of Israel together and say to them, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob has appeared to me, saying, I have observed you and what has been done to you in Egypt, and I promise that I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites. Verse 18, and they will listen to your voice, and you and the elders of Israel shall go to the king of Egypt and say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us, and now please deliver us, or please let us go 3 days' journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord. And so when God calls his people, when God calls you, when God calls us as a church, and it looks like it's going to be hard, and it looks like it's going to be difficult, and it seems impossible, what keeps us moving forward as a church? What keeps you moving forward as an individual? And this truth has helped shape me as an individual in my own personal walk with God and what he's called me to do. And that's these two things. I always have to be brought back to, first of all, who God is. Yeah, but these people are doing this, and they're saying this, and this is what's happening, and this is, and this. And look what the government's doing. I mean, and look at the laws they're passing, and what? I mean, we tend to focus on all of these external things, and what if we lose our tax exemption, and what if we lose our freedoms, and what if we, and we get afraid, and we get fearful, and we can't move forward because what if this happens? And we focus on all of these things around us, and then what God calls us back to do is say, no, look at me. Look at who I am. Look at the one who's called you. I know what's going on in the world. I know what's happening with the government. Don't focus on that. Focus on who I am. I am the great I am, who's bigger than any obstacle you'll ever face. So if I remember and am focused on who God is and not all of the opposition or all of the circumstances around me, okay, God, you're with me and you're powerful enough to accomplish amazing things through me, through this church, through your people. Then I remember and recall, God, what did you call me to? Don't get sidetracked on another task. And here's honestly, guys, this is the fear and this is the tendency of most people. To back off from the task that God's called you to. To recoil back a little bit. Boy, that's a big deal. And I know you're big, God. I know you're... No. What did God call you to? What did God call you to today? Do that. Like honestly, what did God call you to today? Like today when I woke up, I knew God called me to stand up here today and preach this. I know that, so I'm going to do that. I'm going to do it with everything I am because I know this is what God's called me to do. I know that he's powerful enough in spite of my inadequacies, in spite of my weaknesses, in spite of my baggage, in spite of my past sin this week. He is able to take whatever I say and use it in somebody's life today. So I'm going to press on those things that God has clearly identified as things which need to be done. Listen, we press forward and we don't apologize for it. There's going to be a world that will oppose you. We don't apologize and back off from what we know God's called us to do. We cannot sacrifice the message of the gospel to appease a world that's going to oppose us. What happens is when we get sidetracked on what God's called us to do, which is what? What has God called us to do? Reach people far from Christ, teach them to follow him. Go into all the world, make disciples of all nations, make disciples, make disciples. What happens is that can be hard, that can be difficult, that poses challenges, that becomes messy, that becomes difficult. So what happens is, the church can tend to focus on other things. And so when the church get involved, let's focus on this and let's focus on this. And what Satan will try to do is to get us to focus on everything but our mission. Or he'll get us to focus on each other, fighting each other, battling each other, frustrated with each other. But if God calls and if he's with us and if his presence is here, we must constantly be brought back to what God presented to Moses in the beginning. Who am I, Moses? Who am I? I'm the great I am. Secondly, what did I call you to do? Go do it. And so we as a people identify what is it that God's calling us to do. And in the church, God works through the congregation of saints. God works through the leadership of elders, through the service of deacons, and God moves through the teaching of his word. And God propels the church along. And we are going to face fears and challenges and obstacles in the days ahead. We will. It's not going to be easy. But if we'll constantly remember those two things, who is God and what has he called us to do as a church, I guarantee our best days are ahead of us, and we'll see God do some amazing things through this church and in your lives. And so we end with verse 19. It says, God says, Moses, go to deliver my people. Verse 19, but I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless compelled by what? By my mighty hand. It's not, at the end of the day, Moses, it's not up to you. In fact, I'm going to let you know right now, Moses, when you go, you're going to face some opposition. You're going to face some really big challenges. But I'm doing that so that he will know that I'm the one true God. And he will be compelled by my mighty hand. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all wonders that I will do in it. After that, he will let you go, and I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. And when you go, you shall not go empty. But each woman shall ask for her neighbor, and any woman who lives in her house for silver, gold, jewelry, and for clothing. You shall put them on your sons and daughters, and you shall plunder the Egyptians. So what God is saying in these last few verses is this truth. The task is never too big for the great I am. Never. It's never too big. It may seem big to us, it may seem huge to us, but listen, the task I've called you to is never too big for the one true God of heaven. Never. And that at the end of the day, the greatest tasks are not accomplished by the ones who are called, but by the one who calls them. So are we a strong, gifted, amazing group of people? At the end of the day, not really. And I know that doesn't sound super positive, but the reality is we are broken, aren't we? Moses was a broken man. We're going to find next week, Moses had all kinds of issues and all kinds of reasons not to do this. Moses was not the most gifted guy in the world. But what we're finding is that God doesn't always say, hey, I'm going to choose the most talented, the most gifted, the best, the most organized. What God says is I take regular men and women, just normal, average, everyday church folk, and I do amazing things in them. Why? Because it is the one who calls us that accomplishes those tasks, not us who are called. So is God doing something in this church? Absolutely. We can see it. We can see him saving people. We can see him changing people. Do we have a long ways to go? Oh my word, yes we do. But God's alive and God's at work. And God's calling us to reach people far from Christ and teach them to follow him. What we have to remember are these two things. Who is God and what has he called us to do and what has he called you to do? Find out what that is and then realize that the great I am, the great God of heaven, is with you. And if he's with us, there will be no task that's too big for us.